today's edition of Public Forum, I'm asking on key outcomes and discussing important outcomes of the just concluded G20 summit. And with me, the Dean of Jindal School of International Affairs, Professor Sreeram Chaulia. Thank you very much, Professor Chaulia, for joining us in this program. So in the first segment, let's try and understand the key takeaways of G20 summit. What sort of agenda the Western nations will have from here? Because military intervention will continue. This is very much evident what President Obama actually said.
Well, the G20 showcased some of these contradictions clearly because President Putin named 40 countries from whom financing is flowing to ISIS and other jihadist groups. And these included G20 member nations who are sitting right at the table. So that is the first contradiction. Turkey, the host, President Erdogan, claims that the real problem is Assad regime and that is the #1 problem. And that, he says that now we are against Daesh or ISIS, but essentially he has also been a major conduit and a facilitator of this monster that we have seen. I mean, Saudi financing, yes, Qatar, all of them, Kuwait, yes, the Gulf monarchies did, but the biggest culprit, in my view, has been Turkey. And so this complicity has led to this crisis. And now Turkey is holding the presidency of G20 and pontificating about how we can counter terrorism, right? So there are contradictions in this. But nonetheless, that said, we must understand the nature of the G20. The G20 is an informal institution. It's not an UN type organization or let's say a WTO type organization where there are going to be incentives, disincentives and penalties and sanctions. Rather what it does is more like a guidance mechanism. It's more like a statesman of grouping of elders kind of thing that was created after the financial crisis began in 2008. So at least on paper we have a normative thing now come in. Even the mission creep that my colleagues have pointed out, there is mission creep, no doubt. But then the dysfunctionality of the UN Security Council.
There are no binding agreements. This is not in terms of how do you really formalize the very nature of G20?
Where is the forum to actually create any consensus outside the G20? I mean, the UN Security Council is unrepresentative. It is already divided between Chinese and Russians on one side and the Western ones on the other. And the veto usage has restarted again after a drop after the end of the Cold War. So G20 automatically will be able to take on, hopefully should be able to take on these things. But by its very nature, it's only a summit kind of system with some ministerials and some working bodies and so on.
How do you see the role of the emerging economies vis-a-vis the developed ones?
Well, barring India, there's not much bounce with the emerging economies either right now. In fact, I was expecting more pressure on Xi Jinping at G20, but perhaps the focus was a little, elsewhere, because he essentially is under pressure to explain why the Chinese economy is slowing down so much, because it has a drag down effect on almost everybody, because China is such a major trading, power in the world, and also a major consumer of raw materials and so on. So, but he assured the group actually at the summit that we will still be on course for 7%. But frankly speaking, it's more like 4 or 5%, the real GDP growth of China, because the Communist Party continues to massage the figures. So it looks like, the focus should be on China in many ways, because Xi Jinping said we will still contribute to 1/3 of the global GDP growth. And the group as a whole continue to vest faith in its original target of Brisbane summit last time, which is 2.1% growth by 2018. And it doesn't look that way. And so they're making the right noises in the sense, where we need higher investment, both public investment, private investment. People are sitting on piles of cash.
Fighting unemployment, also the youth unemployment.
The coordinated stimuli that had been done earlier for, state spending to, revive demand did work to some extent to prevent this from becoming a Great Depression. But nonetheless, we will need another round of government stimulus spending, because the markets are so dependent on state spending right now. And this is where G20 has to give guidance, has to move the IMF, has to move in a direction. Sachinji mentioned employment. How do you generate? There are national plans for employment everywhere. Where how can a transnational scheme be set up where some states are spending more, some are spending less, some are
so
buying
women get
more,
a bigger role in the workforce,
rebalancing
in the labor force, and also youth unemployment. These were two issues which are also least, in this year's G20 summit. Professor
In
Chaulia, I'd
such
like
a
to respond to
document.
that because, IMF reforms is something very, very important, and even IMF voting, because China is underrepresented dramatically in the IMF voting. The US has about 16% of the share, China has 4%, India has 3%, and Brazil has 2%. So how do you see this? Because underrepresented, overrepresented, and when you talk about the overall reforms, how do you see the countries moving together here?
Well, the Europeans have also been sitting over some of their shares, even though they don't deserve it in terms of size and proportion of the world economy and all that, which is relatively in decline. So the Americans were trying to actually reduce the the voting power and the shares of some of these European countries. But eventually, it comes down to this, what Ambassador Kajju has been saying as well, which is the Americans still are under an illusion that it is a post-Cold War era, where it's a unipolar world, but it's not, right? And so, the crisis did actually force them to create this innovative new thing, which is the North and South combined, which is G20. But then, so the G7 has become outmoded, therefore they needed G20, right, to bring in all the other players. But now, as we move forward, American growth is relatively looking okay. I mean, it's not great, it's only around 2%. And for the foreseeable future, they're still in crisis. The unemployment statistics they give out, 6%, 5%, actually also fallacious, because the ones who are not reporting employment, who are not turning up for jobs, is much higher.
Right, but the current economic scenario where consumption is going down, how do you really see the economy is improving? Be it China, which is trying to really improve its own domestic consumption.
So that's where investment is critical, right? Public and private investment is critical. And secondly, there was a very important point at G20, which is about inequality.
Right.
And that needs to be increased, because if wages increase, that's when purchasing power grows, right, for society. The ones who are ultra elite are only going to be buying yachts and the private jets, not the basic stuff that drives economic growth overall, right? So we have to increase consumption.
There's issues also of interest rates, because this is haunting all the central banks, even here in India, when much is being decided by the Federal Reserve, whether the rates will go up or not, and that will have an impact, sort of a domino effect on other economies also.
That's been a Damocles' sword hanging on all over necks, and G20 has been very clear that whenever major monetary policy changes are done, they need to be communicated well in advance and clearly, so that it doesn't create panic. Because there has been a run on emerging economic currencies, including the rupee, just almost a year ago, and we are not sure about what the aftershocks will be if the US Federal Reserve again raises interest rates. So G20, my imagery of G20 is as someone who can steady the ship. It cannot save us from destruction. And right now, we are headed somewhat in a positive direction since the crisis of 2008. We have not recovered. And what all the advisory roles and the guidance role that the G20 plays is to at least warn the trespassers, warn the worst offenders, that listen, there is something called a global opinion, a consensus, whatever you call it, at least you sign it, right? Even Saudi signs against terrorism, even Turkey signs against terrorism. So at least that is there, and that should be creating a normative framework for us to go. So we've got the ideas on the table in the communique as to what are the right things that need to be done. Who is to be held accountable for violating, of course, is a different issue, but at least, prescriptively, normatively, we want an ideal outcome, and that's what G20 should represent.